Our speaker this morning is Miss DeOrnellas. Miss DeOrnellas teaches English and journalism. She arrived at Hill in 2020 after 11 years working and advising student journalism programs in Oklahoma, North Carolina, and California. She is a lifelong swimmer and a loyal fan of UNC men's basketball and USA women's soccer. She is headed to Temple University in the fall to begin work on a master's degree in journalism. Miss DeOrnellas.
As Eliza Schlesinger says, I'm an elder millennial. I was in middle school during peak boy band, but I wasn't actually an NSYNC or Backstreet Boys person. Savage Garden was my favorite. Guessing many of you would recognize their biggest hits, but I don't know how many of you would know the title track on their album Affirmation. The chorus is that 90s kind of light techno, but a cappella, it would sound a little like this. I believe in karma, what you give is what you get returned. I believe you can appreciate real love till you've been burned. I believe the grass is no more greener on the other side. I believe you don't know what you've got until you say goodbye. That last line is much more complicated than it sounds. Graduation is a time in which you say goodbye to a version of yourself, and you say goodbye to others, and you start making decisions about which goodbyes you're okay with being final and which you're not. And you think about who you are and who you want to be. I was a journalist in high school and I wanted to stay one. I had this ingenious theory about the world that being a journalist meant being a writer, but with a paycheck. Of course, considering the recent history of that profession, that was a particularly naive assumption. But if you'd materialized in front of me at my high school graduation and you told me that 15 years later, being a journalist would mean watching a celebrity realtor win a presidential election against a woman with decades of government experience, and then running election coverage at the boarding school campus to which that then sitting president had sent his eldest sons, and that in order to feed the newsroom on election night, I'd have to put on latex gloves and individually parcel out slices of pizza because we were in the middle of a once-in-a-century pandemic and no one yet knew for sure whether or not the virus could live on surfaces, I would have told you that something was very, very wrong with your time machine. Yet now I'm standing here in a space that reminds me so much of the Catholic churches I grew up in, except there's no crucifix, just a motto that we've literally chiseled in stone: whatsoever things are true. The truth is, I was 22 and a first-year teacher in Oklahoma when I woke up 10 days late and had to beg my next-door teaching neighbor to cover my class so I could go to the doctor because I couldn't make my brain relax until a medical professional had administered a urine test. I remember sitting in front of a doctor I'd met maybe once before and having her look at her wall calendar and say, "When was the last time your boyfriend was in town?" "Oh yeah, you were probably ovulating then." If you ever wanted to scream and cry, and you want to do both so badly that they just cancel each other out and you end up staring at the person in front of you like they've just stepped off a spaceship, that's what the word speechless means. And that feeling lasted till I got back to school. I stepped into creative writing and a student said, "Are you okay? You look like you've been crying." And I said, "No, I never cry." And all the swallowed tears threw off my sarcasm register. So she just ended up staring at me going, "Are you serious?" And I took a deep breath and said, "No, I'm not. I'm actually having a very bad day." And both the students sitting directly in front of me simultaneously went, "Oh my God, we are too." And we spent 5 minutes talking about how bad days feel. I will always remember that it was a student who looked me in the eye and essentially said, "Be honest," and that the flashing red subtext was, "Be honest so I can be too." Honestly, I know some of you are now distracted and that you may continue to be distracted throughout the rest of this talk because you feel you have not yet received a key piece of information. If that is you, I suggest you spend some time in the near future meditating on whether or not you truly believe that private conversations between a woman and her doctor should remain private conversations between a woman and her doctor until such time as that woman chooses to share. And maybe look up Schrodinger's cat because it's a thoughtful experiment that is useful way beyond the bounds of physics. Speaking of lessons from school that are useful again years later, I was a senior when my vice principal decided to confiscate all copies of our newspaper because we'd run an article with the radical thesis that sometimes in the spring, some students at some high schools across the US like to do this thing called a prank. He perceived that article as dangerous. That's how I found out what the Student Press Law Center is. My advisor said to me, "There are people who will give you legal advice, call them." So I did, and I swear the person on the other end of the phone was more upset than I was. He started into this frenzied speech about how we were in Northern Virginia and that's close to DC, which is a major media market, and this could be huge. And I stopped him and said, "It's May and I'm a senior. I don't have time for a years-long court battle. Tell me how to fix this now." And he said, "Oh, well, now you talk to your principal." So we did, and I know now, looking back on it, as a person who has spent 13 years being the adult in rooms like that it's highly implausible that my advisor wasn't in the room. But I honestly do not remember whether he was or not. I was the editor-in-chief, I ran the meeting. In the end, our principal agreed to pay to reprint the papers as they were, and we agreed to insert a flyer containing a letter she'd written about her belief that pranks are dangerous during testing season. What I remember the most is that both the student press law center lawyer and my advisor treated me as a young adult with both agency and responsibility. The truth is, I've been called crazy and other less polite terms for wanting to work with teenagers, but most of the people saying that hadn't talked to an actual living, breathing teenager in years. Teenagers are the good kind of trouble. You're honest, you haven't yet decided that the world is the way it is and that another way of being isn't possible. And I know that because every successful movement that has pushed our society forward had young people on the front lines. Think about the young activists who have forced adult politicians to confront the real, imminent, existential threats to our planet. Think about how the Parkland students changed the conversation about school shootings and gun violence. What do those two groups have in common? They do their research. They prove young people are fully capable of debating policy solutions based not just on a frank retelling of their lived experience, but also an unimpeachable bank of data. They know the First Amendment is not a free pass to be a troll or a bully. They know the First Amendment at its heart is a shield that allows the vulnerable to question the powerful. They know free speech is not without consequence. They've been harassed and belittled and labeled whatever insane label the conspiracy theorists are using as their word of the month, and they have not stopped. The truth is, I remember when I stopped speaking up. I was always that kid in elementary school with my hand in the air, because when the teacher asks a question and you know the answer, you raise your hand, right? That's how school works. And then I went to middle school and I figured out how middle school works is no one likes a know-it-all, and they like a know-it-all even less if she's female. So I learned to keep my hand down, and I did not hear my own silence until my junior year English teacher gave me a bad participation grade. To be clear, I'm using bad with the giant air quotes that most of y'all use when you label anything not an A a bad grade. I'm very familiar with the overachiever perfectionist life. And she said to me, "You don't talk enough." And I must have started complaining about it behind her back, because I remember a male friend of mine saying, "But that's not fair. When you do speak, you always have something good to say." And I remember my brain screaming at me, "Oh, that's what she meant. She was right." And then I shook off the bounds of institutionalized sexism, and I never held my tongue again, and I always and forever feel empowered. That's how we tell stories, right? Like the hero gets to the top or maybe the bottom of the mountain, and then they kill the monster and everything is fine and no one is traumatized and monsters don't exist anyway. They're all in your head. That's not true. Monsters exist. Some live in your head, some never moved out from your closet, and some live in the world. And others only move out from under your bed so they can sit on your chest and laugh at you when you think about getting out of bed. We all have bad days, and some of us, including me, have a lot of bad days, and we get a little too good at hiding it. And we sometimes need to remind ourselves how many people there are who will be there for you if you ask. The truth is, you will fall so many times while you're scaling your mountain. You will have skin knees and skin palms. You start feeling like a child again, like a little kid who just can't make it across the monkey bars. And then you will fall down and fail again. Failures are real, but the only failure you can't come back from is the decision to give up. Whatever truly matters to you in this world, that is worth fighting for. For me, it's the ability to tell the truth. The truth is, in 2020, I'd filled out dozens of applications in an attempt to leave the classroom and get back to reporting, and I'd had no success until I found the Pointer Koch Fellowship. Pointer is the best in the business when it comes to journalists training journalists. The Koch brothers are energy sector billionaires whose money has fueled right-wing causes throughout the United States. Those institutions have little in common beyond a professed belief in free speech, and I had massive questions about the ethical implications of such a partnership. But the fellowship placed you in a newsroom, and that's where I wanted to be. So I applied and was ecstatic to make it to the final round of interviews. We arrived at the standard, what questions do you have moment? And I said, I don't know how to phrase this, but I have to ask. And I barely even started formulating the question when the veteran journalist in charge of the fellowship looked at me and said, is it the Coke question? Journalists ask me that question all the time. No one has asked me that who's applying for this job. He did answer the question. I did not get the fellowship. I have zero regrets. I would have felt like a coward if I hadn't asked. The truth is, it is an enormous power and privilege to live in a country where the First Amendment exists. Many of you weren't born US citizens. That doesn't mean you don't have a right to free speech. That means your right to free speech is currently being oppressed. All of you are experiencing that on some level. No system is perfect, including the First Amendment. Students have more legal restrictions placed upon their free speech than anyone else living in America, and the First Amendment doesn't even cover private schools. Public schools are state actors, they're government entities. At a private school, you have to read the fine print in the handbook or work to rewrite it. The First Amendment also doesn't cover private or public companies, in case recent news has confused you on that front. None of that is to say a rich person define it. Think about all the other times in history in which the law had not yet caught up to your rights. Remember that Student Press Law Center organization I was talking about? Their current legal project is called New Voices. It seeks to enshrine in state law additional protections to allow students to exercise their freedom of speech and to protect journalism advisors who act in defense of that right. These laws exist in various forms and various strengths across the country. The proposed Pennsylvania version, which has been drafted and debated upon in the legislature but has not yet passed, does actually explicitly include protections for private school students. That inclusion is relatively rare in these bills, and making that part stick, as well as getting the bill passed into law, will require additional advocacy. Those wishing to learn more can visit newvoicespa.com. I believe your voice matters. I'm not the only adult who thinks so, but that doesn't matter if you don't think so. Figure out what it is you care about and fight for it, because you can. You are capable. Not tomorrow, not when you grow up, now. You are already capable. I do not want to see whatsoever things are true become just something you use to print on your t-shirts. Make it a conscious decision every day. Use your voice to say something that matters.